Thank you, everyone. Today I have with me two highly accomplished academics in the biological sciences. And thank you for deciding to be part of this conversation, although some of us might believe that you haven't really made that decision. It wasn't your own free will. So I have Professor Robert Sapolsky with me and Professor Kevin Mitchell. I'll introduce them in turn. Professor Sapolsky is a professor of biology, neurology, and surgery at Stanford University. He's the author of multiple books, including a Primate's Memoir, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, Behave, which I also have here on my desk, and Determined, Life Without Free Will, which is right there in the corner. I first encountered him when I was an undergraduate student. I watched his lecture during my second year of my computer science and philosophy degree whilst procrastinating, and I found them highly interesting. So reading Behave again afterwards was highly stimulating for me. And his opponent today, and I'm going to say in a minute why I'll call him his opponent, is Professor Kevin Mitchell, who's a professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. His research primarily concerns the relationship between the wiring of the brain and the human faculties, and he wrote a highly interesting book called Innate: How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are. And I encouraged all of you to watch his lecture delivered at the Royal Institution, which is available on their YouTube channel. And his latest book is called Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. And his book is right there. Obviously, both authors today decided to write a book about free will from the perspective of biology, which is quite interesting because a lot of discussions about free will are very physics focused. But they reached opposite conclusions. So one author argues that the best biology that we have today shows that free will is non-existent or at least very negligible. And the other shows that an evolutionary perspective can show us why we can legitimately call ourselves free agents. And to that effect, I'm going to give the stage to Professor Kevin Mitchell for a 10-12 minute opening speech, followed by a 10-12 minute opening speech by Professor Sapolsky.
That's great. Thanks very much, Theodore, and thanks, Robert, to you for joining. I'm really looking forward to this. It's been great fun to read your book and see, it's so interesting that we do look at the same evidence and come to very different conclusions. So, unpicking that is going to be fun, I think. So the question, do we have free will, is the one that we're here to discuss and debate. And really it comes down to whether we're able to make decisions and choose our own actions. And it certainly feels like we can, at least most of the time. It seems like we go around choosing things and making decisions. And it feels like we're in charge of our own actions. But maybe we're deluded. Maybe it's all just neural mechanisms. Maybe we're just robots acting out our programming. Or maybe, even worse, we're just collections of atoms or particles that obey the laws of physics. And I think the key question is, given that we are physical systems and none of us wants to invoke magic, how could what happens be up to us as selves, as whole entities? So we're not just pushed around by our parts, and we're not just places where complicated things happen, but we ourselves are causal entities, and that we use our cognitive powers to truly decide what to do. Because I think that's what people take when we say we have free will, is that what they're thinking can actually determine their actions. So when we ask, do we have free will? There's obviously, we have to figure out what free and will mean, but I think less obviously, but equally importantly, we have to figure out what we means. What does the we part mean there? What does it mean to be a self? I think that's a really key, crucial question in this debate. And then we need to understand how a self could be free to do various things and how it could choose between them. So in my book, I take an evolutionary approach to that question, as Theodore said. I think if we want to understand free will in humans, where it's extremely complicated, we really need to understand much more basic kinds of agency in much simpler organisms. And the very brief sketch of the book is that, thinking first about living organisms, what they are, they're sets of interlocking processes. Really, they're patterns of activity that persist through time. And they do work to stay out of thermodynamic equilibrium with the environment. So they're trying to stay that way. And in order to do that, they need to take in energy, they need to take in food to remain organized that way. But there's a problem. The world is very changeable. So the organism can't just sit there. It has to be able to adapt to changing conditions. And one way to do that is to sense what's out in the world and have some systems to control its own physiology or even to control its behavior in the world appropriately. And even the simplest creatures, like single-cell bacteria, for example, have these kinds of systems. So bacteria can sense things like chemicals outside them. Sometimes they're nasty and they move away from them. Sometimes they're good, like a food source, and the bacterium can move towards that. And it might seem like a really simple mechanism that controls that. We know a lot about the biochemistry and cell biology of how that happens, but it's not an isolated mechanism. It happens in a really holistic and integrated way. Even this really, really simple behavior of this really, really simple creature. They're not just pushed around by these isolated mechanisms within them. They're making holistic decisions. So they're integrating all kinds of cues at once. They're processing that information in the context of all kinds of their own current conditions and their recent history. That's how they know which way to go in order to derive the optimal behavior, which is optimal for the whole organism, right? It's the good of the whole organism that is determining what the organism does. It's not the reasons of its parts. So it really is the organism doing something for its own reasons, even at that simple level. Now, here I am talking about reasons. How could I be? How could reasons have any power in the world if physics is really deterministic? If all the atoms and particles that these things are made up of are just controlled by the Schrödinger equation or some of the, the basic laws of physics, well, why or how would you ever get macro scale functional systems like that? And I think the answer to that question is you wouldn't. Those things just wouldn't arise because there'd be no way in which they could get selected for that functionality. So the good news is that the world is not predetermined in that way. Physics does not say that. It's not just at quantum levels, but even at classical levels, physics is not fully deterministic. The low-level details at any moment, plus the laws of physics, underdetermine the future of any system. So the future is radically open. We don't have to start with this idea of determinism and then try and figure out how an organism could be free. We can start with the best understanding of physics that the future is, that the world is indeterministic, and then we don't have to ask where the freedom comes from. The freedom comes for free, right? What we have to ask instead is where the control comes from. How does an organism make happen what it wants to happen in that noisy, indeterministic universe? And the answer to that actually comes from the indeterminacy itself, in the sense that the low-level indeterminacy opens the door for the way that a system is organized to have some causal influence over how it evolves. And that's not a, it's a fairly commonplace idea that, my computer here is organized in a certain way to do things, right? And so if we think about an organism, then organisms have been organized in a way through the power of selection that gives them these functionalities that foster the persistence of the organism. And it means that there's genuinely causal power at these higher levels of the system. All the causality doesn't just come from these low-level atoms bouncing around. So living organisms could evolve that are trying to persist and that develop systems designed to help them do that. And of course, in multicellular creatures, those systems include nervous systems that again are designed to sense things out in the world and control behavior accordingly. And as such creatures got more and more complex, their nervous systems developed more and more internal layers. So where, for example, they could do more sophisticated kinds of sensory processing, so they could parse like incoming visual data, for example, to infer what objects are out in the world. And at the same time, they can represent their internal state. They can include their current motivations and their goals, their ongoing activities. So they build a model of the self and a model of the world, and they link that to all the knowledge that they have accumulated about the world through learning. Because of course, that's the other great payoff of having nervous systems, is we can learn the properties of different kinds of objects. We can learn what actions are good or bad from different situations that we've been in through time. So we can use all of that. We can operate over all those parameters to decide what to do. So that's cognition, right? We're doing cognition. And of course, there are neural mechanisms that instantiate that, where the neural patterns correspond to these objects of cognition. So these beliefs and desires and intentions. So organisms in this process bring to bear all the things they've learned from their past history to help guide their behavior towards the future. So in this way, they're not free from all prior causes in the way that some people would say they must be for it to count as free will. They literally incorporate information about the past to give themselves greater causal power in the world, to direct the future in adaptive kinds of ways. So they're using cognition to do decision making. And what I want to argue is that that can't be reduced to some sets of reflexive neural circuits, even really, really complicated ones. The organism has to navigate an ever-changing world with all sorts of novel situations that it doesn't have any programmed responses to. It couldn't. So to get the kind of flexible behavior that you see in complex animals, especially in humans, we really have to think about things. We really have to operate in this cognitive arena where we have these mental objects that we're manipulating. And that thinking has real causal power. Now, you might say, well, that's how could that be? How could an immaterial thought have any causal power in a physical system, like pushing atoms around? But thoughts are not immaterial. They're patterns of neural activity. And patterns of neural activity in one part of the brain can obviously affect activity in other parts. That's just how the nervous system works. Now, you might also say, doesn't that mean that it's all reducible to such neural firings? That just sounds like neural mechanism. Well, no, I want to argue that it isn't, because it's the meaning of those neural patterns that matters. That's what gives them causal power in the system. The low-level details of neural firings are arbitrary. They're incidental, and they're filtered out. They're actively coarse-grained over. So that's not where the causal power lies. It's not where the causal sensitivity lies in the system. It's whether there's a pattern that means A or a pattern that means B. That's the information that the organism is using when it's thinking about things. So just because neuroscience is identifying more and more of the mechanisms that underpin cognition and decision-making does not mean that you're not really doing cognition and decision-making, that it's all just the systems that are doing it. No, those are just the systems you use to do cognition and decision-making. And I think, by analogy, just because we're revealing more and more of the details of how our visual system works doesn't mean we're not really seeing, right? We are really seeing. You can't reduce seeing to the level of the neural mechanisms that it depends on, and you can't reduce cognition to that level either. So I want to argue we really do make decisions as selves for our own reasons in ways that are genuinely up to us because they have to be. There's just no other way to solve the kinds of problems of an unpredictable world except by doing this cognition, by thinking about things. Now, one further objection that I know Robert is going to make is that all that thinking may be totally determined by prior causes, all the things in our past that have influenced the way our brain and effectively our mind is configured. So Robert is going to talk about our genetics and the way our brain developed and our prior experiences and so on. And as Theodore mentioned, I wrote a previous book called Innate, which is all about that. So the fact that we have these predispositions. The difference is I see these as influences on our behavior, and I think Robert will claim that they're determinants, that collectively they leave no room for you to decide anything. And of course, those influences exist, but they're part of the history that organisms incorporate that make themselves. That's what gives them any kind of continuity through time, is by having that history and by staying organized in that way. But it doesn't mean those influences completely determine what happens at any moment. I don't think they could, because the organism can't rely on those kinds of general tunings from our genes or even particular bits of knowledge to resolve what to do in every situation. It still has to think about things. So our freedom is not absolute. It couldn't be. We wouldn't be selves if we didn't have constraints through time. But we do have degrees of freedom, and we exercise choice within them. So I want to say two more things. One, we don't just decide momentary behaviors. We're not just reacting to stimuli and choosing option A or option B. We're selecting goals, and we're making plans, and we're sustaining behavior through time to achieve those plans. So we're making the future what we want it to be, even in humans, the far future, what we want it to be. So we can plan in ways that other organisms can't really do. And finally, we have capacities of introspection and metacognition that I think set us apart from other animals. We can think about our thoughts and reason about our reasons. We can deliberate, and we can consider, and we can reconsider if we need to. So I would say that we can decide what to want. It's not just that we're acting on our reasons. We're deciding what reasons to have. When we select goals, that's exactly what we're doing. We do that all the time, I would say. And we develop policies and meta-policies and ways of behaving that ultimately come to constitute our character. So my final point would be to say that the way we come to be, the way we're configured right now, is not just the consequence of loads of things that have happened to us, where we're just passively having experiences. No, instead, we're choosing things, right? We're choosing things all along. Those choices affect the way that, that we develop, but they also can be choices about how we should behave in the future. And I will leave it there. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you for this opening speech, Professor Mitchell. Professor Sapolsky, you're muted now, but you can unmute yourself. Yeah, okay, cool. So now the stage is yours, and you can give your opening speech, and then you're gonna cross-examine each other for a bit. I'm gonna mute myself now.
Great. First off, Kevin, thank you for not only writing such a great book, but for publishing it the same season as mine. It's like God's gift to a cranky, sort of opinionated author who's arguing a very extreme stance for a great book to come out the same time, arguing exactly the opposite. And I certainly hope every man, woman, and child is giving a gift pack of our 2 books for the holiday season coming up, so that we can both go off on a nice ski vacation together. Okay, so starting off, Kevin has already outlined some of what I'm going to be saying, but heck, why not continue with it? I put a particular emphasis on the notion of intent, which has dominated a lot of thinking about free will debates, and making use of it in a way that is atypical. Most people look at intent, and there's a strong intuitive sense that that is where we display our agency. And that feeling of that intuition often revolves around questions such as, were you conscious of your intent? Were you aware of what the outcome was likely to be? Very crucially, did you understand that there were options, alternatives available to you? You were not being coerced. And for a lot of people, for example, often in the criminal justice system, that's the beginning and the end of the questions that needs to be asked. And if the answer is yes, you intended, you knew there were alternatives, culpability has been shown, and there is responsibility in our sense of free will. And for my perspective, that's exactly the starting point, because that analysis omits a critical question, and a question that is so critical that just asking, starting with intent, is like reading the last 3 pages of a book and trying to review the book based on that, because all of these ignore the critical question, where did that intent come from in the first place? And by that, I don't mean that in a very proximal sort of way. Where did your intent to pull the trigger now that you're robbing the bank come from? How did you decide the person needs to be shot rather than just threatened, whatever? How did you form that intent? Instead, I mean it from the much larger sense. How did you become the person who has entered that bank and wants to rob it, rather than being someone who entered it and wants to make a deposit or to come in and ask the teller behind the desk there to marry you, or ask that? How did you become a person where that is what you did at that juncture? And the answer is, radically enough, that moment happened because of what came just before that. And what came just before that and before that all the way down. Translated into the sort of science that Kevin and I think about, it's saying, okay, what happened in the second before you pulled that trigger, forming that intent? What was happening in this part of the brain? Which neurons were excited? Which other ones were silent? All of that sort of thing. But that's also asking the question, what was going on in your sensory environment in the seconds to minutes before? And all we have to do is look at, we make very different sorts of decisions filled with very different kinds of intent. If we're tired, if we're stressed, if we're happy, if we're starving, and so on. And we even know the nuts and bolts of how stress hormones, gonadal hormones, things of that sort, and nutrient states will influence our decision making. But we're also asking what were going on with those hormone levels in the previous days. And we know, for example, if androgen levels are elevated in you, whether you are female or male, when androgen levels are doing that, you later are more likely to interpret a neutral facial expression as a threatening one and form an intent to act accordingly. But even further back, what were your previous months to years about? And we know, as one example, if you had undergone horrible trauma during that period and you've developed PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, there are structural changes in your brain that are detectable with MRI, and it makes you more likely to see threat than other people see. It makes you more likely to interpret neutral circumstances as threatening ones, and thus you're more likely to form the intent to pull that trigger. But we have to push back further, back to development with a completely critical period, your late adolescence, early adulthood. That's because when, I think convincingly, the most interesting part of your brain is going through its final period of maturation. Your frontal cortex, which will make you do the harder thing if it's the right thing to do. And that could involve impulse control, emotional regulation, gratification, postponement, long-term planning, all that sort of thing. And remarkably, the frontal cortex is not fully formed until you're about 25 years old. So the world that is teaching you what counts as the right thing to do is having a very formative thing well into early adulthood. And then logically going back to childhood and this radical discovery a few years back that childhood matters. Childhood has something to do with the sort of adult brain you're going to have. And what we've mostly been doing since then is filling in the nuts and bolts of how that occurs. Epigenetic influences that could be lifelong, involving changes in genetic regulation. And then what was initially a shocking discovery, you've got to push the same thoughts back to prenatal life because environment doesn't begin at birth. And literature by now showing the hormone levels, the nutrient levels you were exposed to by way of your mother's bloodstream will have very significant impact on the sort of brain you were constructing. And all you need to do is look at somebody with fetal alcohol syndrome, and you see a very unsubtle example of that dictum. But look instead at how stressed was your mother during her pregnancy? Was she stressed by being homeless, by being a refugee, by wondering how she was going to pay the rent at the end of the month? And her stress hormone levels in the bloodstream are going to have shaped the construction of parts of your brain that will be in place when you are an adult deciding whether or not to pull that trigger. And of course, genes then come into it. And Kevin and I are both very sort of intent on sort of shouting to the world that genes are not deterministic in this behavioral realm very often, but instead are modulatory proclivities, vulnerabilities, things of that sort. So that gets factored in. And then you've got to factor in something as bizarre and unexpected as culture. What sort of culture were your ancestors coming up with 500 years ago? Parentheses, what sort of ecosystems made certain cultures more likely to evolve than others? And that seems about as irrelevantly distal as you could come up with until you consider that within moments of birth, how your mother was mothering you was an outcome of the culture she was raised in by her parents, who were an outcome of their culture, et cetera, and thus how your brain was being constructed from minutes of birth. Just to give one striking example, people in this sort of business concentrate on the contrast between what they would call collectivist cultures. Flag bearers for that are collectivist rice farmers in Southeast Asia, and individualist cultures, the United States as being the inevitable one that gets brought up. And what you see is within minutes of birth, mothers raised in collectivist cultures versus individualist cultures are going to be doing something as unexpected as singing lullabies to their child, with an average difference in the decibels involved. Collectivist culture mothers sing softer lullabies on the average. How long does a child cry before they are picked up on the average? At what age are they weaned, if they're nursed at all? All of that. Okay, so what we see here is what is potentially an incorrect solution, which is, wow, all of these different disciplines have something to do with how you became the person who you are, carrying out that intent at that moment. What strikes me as the most important thing, superseding that conclusion, is they're not all these different disciplines. They ultimately converge onto one single one. If you were talking about genetics, by definition, you were talking about the evolution of those genes. If you're talking about genetics, by definition, you were talking about early experience and the epigenetic regulation of those genes. If you're talking about genes, you were talking about the proteins that were made in your brain 20 minutes ago. And my overall argument is, when you look at this arc of influences from 1 million years ago and how we evolved into this kind of primate instead of to that kind, and what your amygdala or your frontal cortex did 500 milliseconds ago, when you look at that arc, there's absolutely no place in there in order to shoehorn in a notion of free will that allows your brain to produce behavior that is free of its history. And that's essentially the core of my argument here.
Right. Thank you for this highly interesting talk. I'm now gonna ask Professor Mitchell to unmute himself, and then I'm gonna mute myself again, and I'm gonna give you the opportunity to directly chat to each other. So for 10-15 minutes, I will let Professor Mitchell question you, and then I'm gonna let you question him. So yeah, I'm gonna mute myself and enjoy the duel.
Great. Thanks, Robert, for that. So, as you know, I think we agree on loads of things, right? So we agree that we're not born as blank slates, that there's all this sort of prior influences, including our genetics. I think one thing that, I mean, you talk about there, but that many people kind of miss is the idea that actually most of our nature is just human nature generally, right? You know, we tend to concentrate on these little differences between people, the 0.1% of the genome that's different that affects things. But of course, human nature generally, just evolution, controls lots of our behavior. Of course it does. And our genetics does, the way our brain develops and so on. But I guess where we differ is that you see that whole set as just collectively precluding any possibility for the organism itself, for the whole system, to be deciding things in a free way, where it's for its own reasons. So it's a sort of, I guess, determined by all those prior causes, but at a reductive sort of a level, I guess, in that the neural systems are set in a certain way that they're just going to do certain things in response to whatever the situation. And I guess the first question I would have is, how do you get from seeing these different influences, none of which is determinative by itself, to claiming that they're all determinative together?
Great. Okay, this is the argument basically that while we've learned a lot about neuroscience in recent years or centuries, we've learned a lot about hormones and genes and early experience. And it has given us a surprising amount of explanatory power and predictive power. But what it has not given us is enough explanatory or predictive power to be able to say precisely why this person just carried out this behavior, whereas the person standing next to them did not, as Kevin emphasizes. And basically, the sleazy, like cheap shot, underhanded response that I have by now is that we know enough. We know enough that it is legitimate to say, to reverse the question into, show me a brain that has just produced one of these behaviors that we are impressed with, and show me how it did it independent of everything that came before. In effect, as a thought experiment, take that person and switch out their genome with somebody else's and somebody else's childhood and a fourth person's breakfast this morning and all those sorts of things, and show me how the brain would have produced the exact same behavior independent of all those preceding factors. How is it functioning as an uncaused cause in that case? And my stance is that's not possible to show, because everything about the wiring of that neuron and the circuits in which it's embedded, everything about how many neurotransmitter receptors and reuptake pumps and what flavors of them are an outcome of what came before. And it is simply not possible to show something that would pass for free will in the sense that we understand it to be, free of all this nuts and bolts neurobiology and biology, whether on a reductive or on an emergent level.
So, but Robert, can I ask why? So this demand for an uncaused cause seems to be a point of difference here, right? Because what I would say is that organisms bring their whole history to bear in a decision-making context and use that information to figure out what to do, but with certain degrees of freedom. That is, all of that prior history right now does not determine the next action. And I would say that in order to do it, for that to be true, there's such complexity in the system. The only way that that could be true is if physical determinism were true. Right? There's no other way really that you could get all those prior causes that you're talking about in the system to completely determine what would happen with no degrees of freedom, unless it was really at the lowest levels of all of the physics. Whereas I would say if all of that physics is not deterministic, then the organism can settle the outcome, taking all those influences into account, using all that history as part of, first of all, part of being a self, but secondly, part of just the fact that it has accumulated knowledge and causal power through its experience, through evolution, through its individual learning, so that it can behave adaptively. Does that not satisfy you as a sort of a free will that seems reasonable and naturalistic, and isn't this kind of magical uncaused cause version?
Nah, not for a second. Okay, so in terms of responding to that, both you and I focus a lot on what types of indeterministic things our nervous systems can come up with. And thank God, both of us agree that we don't have to have a discussion right now about quantum indeterminacy running the world. And we're both willing to ignore that. Instead, what we focus in on, in some circumstances, neurons release neurotransmitters spontaneously. Neurons have action potential spontaneously. And what's most interesting, I think, to both of us is it's not random when that occurs. There's certain periods where you were more likely to do that than others. And the term I give for that concept, which you absolutely sort of echo in there, is we have times where we determine it's a good time for some indeterminacy. When certain blood alcohol levels rise, we are more likely to have spontaneous neurotransmitter release of certain types. When we are in moments of crisis, we are more likely to generate options which may fall into domains that they wouldn't otherwise. Yes, we have a nervous system that could generate options. And I think in sort of Daniel Dennett's sense, this would count as an intuition pump. We come up with options that seem to make reasonable sense at the time. And I think what you frame as a two-stage model is we generate some options. And at that point, we choose among them. And essentially what the options generated are is providing some parameters of just how much of a domain we're going to cover at that point. And that will reflect randomness, but also our history of experience, all of that. And then we choose. And that the choosing process is in this dualistic way, separate of what came into generating the options. And I think what we see is a fundamental difference in us at that point as to what is going on with the choosing. And the notion there is when we are choosing, we are expressing a value, we are expressing meaning, we are expressing all of that when we decide to pull the trigger at the teller instead of like turning to our left and shooting our fellow robber. We are expressing cognition, a history of what we've learned about consequences and all of that. But what we are doing implicit in that is expressing a filtering that we have acquired as to what we consider to be the reasonable choices to make in the face of that action. And the question becomes, where did we get that value from? That at that point, the thing that seems like one of the options is to shoot the person rather than wish them a nice day and quickly exit before they get a picture of you. Where does choice come from at that point? And I think my argument would be is it's a recursive loop at that stage. How did we become the sort of person when presented with those options? Parentheses, how did we become the sort of person who would generate those particular options? But more importantly, how did we become the sort of person who presented with those options would choose that particular one? And my conclusion is it doesn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think that I mean, as you've just been talking, right, you've been using the language of choice, you've been using this idea of making decisions and so on, and then asking, what is it that informs those decisions? And I completely agree that prior influences do inform those decisions. They do shape our character, they do shape our personalities, and of course, you know, the way we adapt to circumstances and so on. But what I would say is that those are influences that may bias our decisions and our choices, but that we do make choices. It almost just doesn't make any sense to me to have a conversation using those words if everything we do at every moment is fully determined, right? I mean, I can see there's a range of degrees of freedom, and our cognition is the system that we use to choose between things. That makes sense to me. I mean, what it would, that's my argument. But the idea that all of those prior causes just narrow it down to just one thing, that's I think what I have issue with, because it just seems like an unnecessary step, and one that I don't see where the evidence is for that, you know, grand sort of conclusion.
Well, nonetheless, even if the choice process involves a lack of determinism, and you and I disagree on that one, it is nonetheless using a filter of values, meanings, etc., as to which chosen. Okay, let me give you an example. You go to a movie about some wonderfully inspirational subject, just some average person who pulls off something totally heroic, and you leave the movie changed by that. And as a result, you make a decision in your life. You say, oh my God, that was so inspiring. Tomorrow, I'm going to sign up to work for Amnesty International. And the person sitting next to you comes out of it and says, oh my God, that was such an amazing movie. I can't believe how wonderful the cinematography was. Tomorrow, I'm going to look up all the films of this cinematographer. And the third person comes out and says, oh my God, I can't believe what a cheesy, emotionally manipulative, superficial movie that is. Tomorrow, I'm going to make a list of every movie that director directed and make sure I avoid them forever after. And what we've seen is some options arose, and each of the three people in that scenario chose differently. Why did they choose differently? Because there's entire world of 1 second before to centuries before influences that made one person into the sort of person who would be influenced by this movie, and out comes this choice in that particular way, totally different from the person next to them who experienced the exact same movie and produced a different outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because everything that came before set them up to have filters of predetermined values, tastes, etc., so that one person is looking at the inspiring story and the other person is looking at the camera angles.
Yeah.
My argument would be that's what's going on when we are presented with options,
right,
and we make a choice that intuitively feels laden with free will, but actually is not.
And so, I mean, another way to think about that. So when you're talking about those events driving a decision, it feels like you're isolating particular aspects and saying this was the reason that person did it, and this was the reason that this other person did what they did. And I guess what I would counter that with is to say, well, those things are so complicated, and maybe not that particular example, but a lot of our decisions are so complicated that they have to take into account all of these different variables at once, right? With ambiguous information in an uncertain world that's dynamic, that's changeable, partly because it's full of other agents with their own agendas that we can't anticipate, and so on. So I guess what I want to say is that there's no right answer, right? It's just there isn't. It's computationally irreducible, right? There's in the finite time that we have to make a decision, it can't be deterministic, physically speaking, because there's so many parameters physically going on in there that for this thing to settle into the sort of optimal, whatever we can say, the lowest free energy state, there just isn't a single answer to it, right? There's not a single right thing to do in most situations. What we're trying to do is balance these things, optimize over all these different things, set conflicting goals against each other and try to weigh them and just do our best and muddle through. But to me, that's a whole that involves the whole system, right? It's the whole cognitive system. That's just you thinking about what to do in a way where I would say the outcome is not predetermined. It's determined by your processes of cognition. So I guess maybe we might just have to agree to disagree on that. I guess because it becomes maybe unadjudicatable as to whether it really is in any instant deterministic or not.
Okay, well, I think we're in complete agreement in that, yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. And the causality is hard to detect. Sometimes it's easy to detect the causality. Both you and I have an emphasis when looking at sort of this kind of scenario on cognition, what it is about your prior learning and experience that has made you make the decision that you do at that point. And every now and then we can see an undeniable example where the supposedly freely chosen decision at that point is greatly influenced by a prior factor, which is if somebody has slipped a hallucinogen into that person's Starbucks coffee just before they make this decision, their cognition, as it is, constrained as it is at that point, is going to reach a very different conclusion as to what behavior to choose at that point. That one's easy for us. And I think that one falls in the domain where both you and I would say, yeah, the causality there was best understood in a biological sense. And in the same way, a jury might reach that same conclusion when trying to assess antisocial behavior by someone who had massive brain damage to their frontal cortex after a car accident or whatever. And that's easy for most of us to see that that's a point where we would say this was involitional. we have moved outside the realm where what came 1 second before, 1 minute before, etc., is merely an influence, and instead it was deterministic. Like, you can't hold that person responsible for their gibberish after you slipped in that drug. But what we see is the real challenge is when we're looking in the realm that most of us are thinking about when we're saying, why did that person make that decision? Not because there was a hallucinogen in their Starbucks, but instead because 1,000, 100,000 imperceptibly thin little threads of causality that came before, which collectively form something as unchangeable and coercive as does a car accident that wiped out somebody's frontal cortex. The only difference is it's a whole lot easier for us to perceive one single sledgehammer of a cause rather than wildly traumatically distributed subtle influences there, which nonetheless collectively are as powerful as that single one.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I see Theodore wanted to get out. I do want to come back on a point.
Yes, we're going to return to this perhaps later, but now I have to ask you to switch turns, and I will ask Professor Sapolsky to ask some of his pressing questions. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, the most logical thing at this point is let's continue doing exactly what we're doing, and thus my turn into a question. So, Kevin, what do you think of that? What do you think of the notion that a large percentage of the time when someone has this incredible intuition that they just made a choice, what they're actually saying is, I cannot imagine all of those threads that brought me to that moment. I could imagine, car accident that wiped out this part of my brain being explanatory, but the fact that not only is there an immediacy, a power that we grant to immediacy, and thus we grant all sorts of special properties to it, but also because it's incredibly complicated, as you say, to discern, to accept, to believe that a whole bunch of threads, many of them millions of years old, as to why we turned into humans instead of turning into redwood trees, and explain things starting there, how all of those collectively explain the immediacy of that moment.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it comes down to the difference between influences and determinants. So I would see those things as influences. And I would see, in fact, the examples that you cite there of someone with a prefrontal cortex damage or someone given a drug that affects their perception or decision-making, to me, highlight the fact that decision-making is a real thing. Because otherwise, what's the contrast that we're recognizing in that scenario? And we do, right? We recognize when someone has schizophrenia, or when someone has drug addiction or something like that, that they're not as in control of their behavior as people without those conditions. So for me, if we're recognizing that, that means that there's something that we're talking about, right? This conscious or just general cognitive control of our behavior that can vary between people because it's not a magical thing, right? It doesn't have to have something outside the brain. It's comprised of these systems within our brain. And as I said, just because neuroscience reveals what those systems are, doesn't mean that we're not really using them to do cognition and thinking and decision making. It's not the neural mechanisms. It really is what the patterns that they instantiate mean in the system. So for me, those kinds of contrasts really highlight what it is I think should be the focus of attention. These biological systems that are evolved, that don't require any magic, but that do allow individuals to take all of these influences from their past, take all of this knowledge from their past, and according to their own tunings and predispositions and propensities, decide what to do in a given scenario. And I think, there's a lot of times people will say, well, look, in this scenario, you didn't decide what to do, you just did it. And we all recognize there are cases where we're just impulsive, and sometimes we say, why did I do that? That was so stupid. I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I hadn't said that, right? Or, ideas pop into our head and we don't know why. But I don't think it's right to extrapolate from those kinds of cases, which some people do, to say that all the time thoughts just pop into our head and we never know where they came from, right? Or all the time we just make decisions and we never know why, because we do know why. We can introspect and we can tell each other, right? We can talk about our reasons. We can think about them and we can reconsider them in a this metacognitive kind of a way. So I think we have these faculties that enable us to navigate through the world and guide our behavior through time, that inform how we react to whatever situation we happen to be in a moment, but as a self that has some driving continuity, not just as this reactive kind of mechanism. So I guess I would see those instances where clearly people have less control as evidence that there is control, right? That there's a thing that can be damaged.
Whereas I see circumstances where we can describe to somebody why we made that decision as proving sort of the lack of free will precisely because of the circumstances that could show what's going on beneath the surface. One example, this was a wonderfully interesting paper in Science some years ago, looking at commuters in Boston, and some white bread, middle-class suburb commuting every day into Boston, and a whole bunch of like briefcase-toting executives or whatever. And an experiment was done, which was every day for 2 weeks, standing on the platform was a well-dressed pair of men who were speaking to each other in Spanish, speaking quietly, holding briefcases, all of that. And this was done every single morning for a number of weeks. And then afterward, the researchers managed to corral those commuters in there and give them a whole questionnaire about opinions about stuff, and compared to the control suburban train station just in the next suburb there, what you saw was the mere presence of these two guys speaking Spanish every day to each other caused a significant increase in hostility towards immigration in the United States. And building on your point or focusing on it, if you ask that person, why did you just give it an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 about how much of a problem illegal immigration is, they're going to tell you about our trade imbalance with the Kwakiutl people in Northwestern. They're going to confabulate an explanation for their choice rather than being aware of it. Okay, so that's a wonderful, dramatic, flashy one, but it shows the extent to which our ability to explain our choices sure cannot be a litmus test for whether free will had just been exercised.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because so again, those kinds of scenarios where sometimes people confabulate, where they may be influenced by things that they don't know about. And I mean, I'll say as an aside that a lot of that sort of social priming literature I just find very dodgy and not convincing, and the whole replication crisis has shown that a lot of it isn't very replicable or robust. But generally speaking, anyway, I'm perfectly happy to accept that things are influencing us that we're not really aware of sometimes, and that we are, some particular decisions may be influenced by those subliminal things. But I don't think that means that all of the time we never have insight into why we do things. And we have very good systems that are designed precisely to inspect our reasons and to think about the way that we're thinking, to judge the confidence level. So when we do something, we can say, did it turn out good or bad? Okay, but why? Why did it turn out bad? Was it because the decision was bad? Because the information wasn't very reliable? Because my source wasn't reliable? So all of those things give us extra cognitive power to be able to predict the world and behave better in some future date. And those systems are very well developed. And if they weren't good, right, if they were always just confabulation and after the fact, post hoc rationalization, we wouldn't have them. I mean, if they were so crap that they were not serving an adaptive function, and not just for ourselves, but this whole theory of mind, figuring out what your reasons were, right? I mean, we have these highly developed systems for social cognition to understand our reasons, other people's reasons. That's how we cooperate and get along. So I think you can think like, with optical illusions, for example, you can show that there are cases where we have optical illusions, seeing things that are not out in the world. And you could say, well, that shows our visual systems are never reliable. And that's just not a right conclusion to draw. What it shows is that our visual systems are biologically formed systems that have some vulnerabilities to them. And I'm perfectly happy to accept that our cognitive decision-making systems are the same, right? They have some vulnerabilities to them, but I don't think that means we never know what our reasons are or never can trace, a line of our own motivations.
Okay, so to take this scenario up to a meta level, you carry out a behavior, as you said, and then you evaluate it afterward. Was it successful? Was I operating on false information that people gave me? Is this the sort of person I want to be, et cetera, et cetera? And that's important, and sort of your points there make sense. But there's a meta level, which is, how did you become the sort of person who values self-reflection? How did you become the sort of person who, valuing self-reflection, can actually go and do it instead of watching television at that point? How did you become that sort of person? I think we're in tremendous danger here of reaching common ground.
We might be. Well, actually, I have common ground with you on this. So I think your concern about what philosophers call the problem of moral luck is absolutely spot on, right? Of course, we should be aware that different people are constituted in ways and have the luck of circumstances and so on that have enabled them to achieve certain things, or that have led them, down a path towards, antisocial behavior or criminal behavior or whatever it is, addiction, and so on. So I'm completely on board with that. And I think, especially in the American system, which, speaking as an American, excuse me, but one who hasn't lived there in a while, is, an extremely unfair society. And yet it has this myth of meritocracy, right? And so I agree that just goes way too far, and that we absolutely should take people's circumstances into account when we're judging them, if judging people is a thing we want to do at all. I just don't think it's 100%, right? I still think there's some involvement of the person as we go along, including, I would say, and this sounds old-fashioned, some sort of cumulative involvement in the way that our own character develops. Because the idea that right now the way we're configured, we have no influence over that, is only true if your claim that we never make a choice at all is true, right? So it's a sort of a circular argument. If, as we go along, we really are making choices, then the way we are right now is partly a result of those choices that we've made. And so, I think we can still rescue the idea of responsibility in the moment and responsibility for our character through time without saying it's 100% responsibility and we shouldn't take any other factors into account.
Okay, so what a drag. We're in agreement here.
All right.
In that sort of early on in the book, I say, I happen to believe there's no free will whatsoever, but I recognize that's sort of a lunatic fringe stance. And I'll be perfectly happy if the book convinces readers that there's a lot less free will than conventionally thought, maybe placed in the context of how you phrased it, that there's a whole lot stronger influences. And my conclusion there would be that, yeah, maybe there is a little free will, but there's so much less of it than we think there is, that people need to think differently about certain things. They need to completely trash the notion of blame and punishment. They also need to completely trash the notion of praise and reward. And they have to completely trash notions like feeling entitled about something. And I think that's sort of the logical outcome of even being willing to concede we don't have enough knowledge at this point about the gears underneath the surface to say precisely why this happened, but we can see enough of what preceding antecedent causes produces in terms of outcomes, to know that our view of how the world should be run and judged is desperately wrong.
Yeah, so I would agree with you, except for the completely trash bit. So, completely trash our justice system, or completely trash our, ways of judging, praise and blame and so on, where I would say revise and nuance them in important ways. But, one question though is, don't you think we already do that? I mean, doesn't the legal system, maybe this varies by jurisdiction, but doesn't it already take into account the fact that different people had different circumstances? I mean, we take into account very clearly mental competence, if somebody's prefrontal cortex was damaged, or if they were inebriated, or if they're only a child, or if they have dementia. It feels like the legal system already does that. It recognizes that we have some degrees of freedom, but some people have more than others, either because of external things or internal constitution at the moment. So is such a radical proposal really needed?
Yes, because we're in a realm, I think what we're seeing is, both you and I are subjects of our place and time. If it were 400 years ago, you and I being just as reflective and having the same synapses that we do right now, etc., there's a good chance that both of us would have an intuitive sense that some people are meant to be slaves. They're simply not capable of taking care of themselves. And in fact, it's benevolence on your part to enslave them. And that would make intuitive sense. And now, because we're in this place in time, that makes intuitive sense that that's the most appalling thing imaginable. And what we're seeing at any given point is there are things of that sort that made intuitive sense to me 40 years ago, which now seem appalling. And there will be things 40 years hence. And I would say that at this point, when we are doing an edge case, yeah, there was brain damage, or there was such appalling childhood abuse over and over and over that we can see the size of those threads. All we're doing is proving that things that will become intuitively unacceptable at some point in the future seem okay right now. And we know enough to know that so much of what we are doing right now is not okay.
Yeah.
And so much so that trashing does not constitute a frenzied over-the-top word to use in that context.
Yeah, no, I see the point. And I would say, I mean, you could take, for example, the use of the death penalty as one of those things which many people in the future would be horrified by. We know that's the case because many people in the rest of the world outside countries that have the death penalty are horrified by it. I guess my final point would be, I think you can make all those arguments without having them rest on this absolute metaphysical question. I don't think we have to go to the absolute version of no free will whatsoever in order to justify making those arguments, because you and I both agree there's all these sorts of influences at play that we should take into account and should change the way that we think about people's behavior and their degree of responsibility for it, but I would say in a more subtle way that's much more sort of context sensitive and dependent.
Okay, and I would end by saying that makes total sense as long as we keep thinking our intuitions of what's intuitively obvious right now are not going to stand the test of time and will seem as alien in the future as people thinking that lightning storms are caused by old women who do witchcraft sort of thing. But at the moment, okay, in order to be a good house guest here, if we can agree on a conclusion, yeah, if you want to claim there was free will in why you decided to brush your top teeth before your bottom teeth this morning rather than the other way around, go for it. I think I can grant that, but knowing nonetheless there's a good chance for reasons I can't even begin to imagine, that will seem appallingly unfair to attribute that to free will at some point among our great-great-grandchildren.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you both for this back and forth. I mean, I really enjoyed it as the first audience member that managed to listen to it. And I hope that the viewers which will see this on YouTube will enjoy it too. Before we end, can I ask one question to both of you, if possible? I wanted to ask Professor Sapolsky first. I guess you agree that we have at least this intuitive sense that we're free agents. That might be all an illusion, but we believe that we're the authors of our action. I mean, you're trying to persuade people that this belief is not that secure. But how can you make sense via an evolutionary biology lenses of our illusion that we're free agents?
Because it's wonderfully protective and sort of concluding there's no God, there's no free will, the universe is empty and indifferent and meaningless is kind of a bummer. And for a lot of people, and it's not a surprise that a viewpoint like that is often associated with things like clinical depression and such. We have evolved as the species that knows that someday our hearts are going to stop beating. And the only way to pull that off is we've also had to evolve as a species that is capable of enormous amounts of self-deception and rationalization because it gets us up in the morning.
Right. And how do you make sense of your life's work via this perspective? So, for instance, when you wrote the book that we don't have free will, and perhaps you had to put a lot of effort into it, motivating yourself to write another page and another page, given that in your the back of your mind was, this is not my merit, I'm not really doing this, I'm just a product of low-level things without agency. How do you not feel a tension between those things, or do you think that tension can be argued away?
Oh, I don't feel that tension at all, because 95% of the time I'm a flaming hypocrite and cannot function as if it's really the case. And if somebody afterwards says, whoa, nice shirt or whatever, for 3 milliseconds, I'm going to feel pleased, and somehow interpreting that as I turned out to be a better sort of person than I would have been otherwise, and here's evidence of it. And all I can see as a moral imperative is to stop at that point and reflect and reflect and reflect and get back to, it's not by chance I became a sort of person who would write a book like this. And it's not by chance that I did not turn out to be a serial murderer. And it's not by it, like every now and then, you know, I see it's rather lunatic to expect somebody to function this way all the time, and I sure can't. And maybe all we can hope for is be suspicious of the times that things seem obvious, because every now and then we can function that way. And what we've shown historically is we could do it again and again and again. And we think differently about stuff now than we did in the past. And each time that happens, not only doesn't the roof cave in, it becomes a more humane world. So even amid that, nonetheless, most of the time I can't function this way. And but we need to do the work to get there.
Right. And now I'm going to ask Professor Mitchell 1 or 2 questions. And those are, I mean, you know that there are at least a number of other prominent philosophers who try to use evolutionary theorizing in order to make sense of free will. Daniel Dennett is a prominent example. I wanted to ask you, in what ways does your evolutionary approach differ from Dennett's? And also, it seemed to me, I wrote a paper on Douglas Hofstadter's philosophy of mind, and I was wondering, how do you see your view differing from that of Douglas Hofstadter? So can you please compare your view with those of those 2 authors?
Yeah, so Daniel Dennett has done amazing work explaining in a sense how freedom evolves, as one of his books is titled. I think that actually both Robert and I disagree with his claim of compatibilism and find it incoherent, because if the universe were really, really deterministic, but there's only one future open, it just makes no sense to talk about choices and to talk about agents and causes and doings. There would just be happenings and one line of it. So while we end up in a similar position, the route that he takes to get there, I think, is really suspect. And what I wanted to do instead was take what I take to be where physics actually starts right now, is that the world is indeterministic, and then that just flips the question on his head, right? Rather than saying where does the freedom come from, we have to ask where does the control come from, and that's the the arguments that I try to make, is how that can happen. And the one thing I will say in Dennett's case is that he has all these thought experiments about individuals where you put them in this case and they're going to go kill their uncle, but they don't. But an evil neurosurgeon, unbeknownst to them, has made them do it, and then they did it, but they didn't want to. So are they morally responsible? And it just does your head in. And what I want to say is, look, if you're assuming the world is deterministic, you can't just assume these things exist. You have to go way, way back and tell me, how did it come to be that these agents even evolved in this universe where atoms are just bouncing off each other in deterministic ways? So that's where I differ with Dan. And as far as Douglas Hofstadter's work goes, I love it. I've been very influenced by it. I think one of the sort of main parts that is really, really crucial is this idea of recursive neural processing, where it's not just that there's a one-way hierarchy to some top CEO that just sits there. It's this very much recursive, reverberant kind of patterns of activity that he would say constitute the self, that mediate consciousness, that mediate cognition, and so on. And I would very much agree with that. And I think it's a way out of the infinite regress that gets you to this dualistic idea that for you to be in charge, there has to be something outside that's sort of your brain, but not in your brain, which is, to use a phrase from Robert's book, right? So Hofstadter's view allows that thing to be both of your brain and in your brain, and not a ghost in the machine. It's just the whole pattern. And that just feels intuitively like it's along the right lines to me, although the details obviously have to be worked out.
Okay.
If I may,
sure.
Just briefly, I see the main difference between Kevin and Dennett in thinking about evolution is that Kevin understands evolution and the brain and science and genetics, and make of that what you will from that statement.
Right. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to join me today, and also the audience who hopefully has listened so far. I guess the opening statements really clarified Professor Mitchell's and Professor Sapolsky's position, but hopefully the back and forth allowed you to understand their views a bit better. If you really want to see their careful exposition of their work, this is the books. You have Free Agents by Professor Kevin Mitchell. You have Determined by Professor Robert Sapolsky. And yeah, thank you again for joining me today. And in less than 24 hours, I will send you a link with the video on YouTube. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks so much, Theodore. And thanks a lot, Robert. It was really fun and great to meet you.
Likewise. Let's do this again sometime.
Yeah, it was great to do it in person someday.
Cool.
Good. Thanks for setting this up, Theo.